Hi, everyone. Welcome to the final project in the Materials, Space, and Meaning class. This is a project called the Container Project. And for those of you that have been waiting for a project to maybe explore some materials that you particularly wanted to work with, or had some other ideas that you wanted to explore, the good news is that for the purposes of this project, you have a tremendous amount of freedom. You can work with virtually any materials that you can think of or that you want to work with. So that's great. This project is really quite open like I said, in terms of the material use and how you construct it and where it is and all of your specific approaches. And rather than defining this one by a lot of the more restrictive means that I have used in the past where I only allow you to do certain things, this one, I'm taking a somewhat different approach in that I'm asking you to solve a problem or to engage a more conceptual idea. So you probably want to pull up your project description, which you're going to find on Moodle, and we'll take a look at that. And I think probably the best way to do this is going to be to go through the first couple, the purposes, the project description, and then really look at the images. This is a bigger slide lecture than I typically do. There's about 50 images, and I'm going to talk about each one a bit more in depth because this project, rather than giving you sort of parameters, what I'm offering you are examples of how other artists have kind of how to how other artists have maybe approached the idea of container or approached the idea of this particular kind of situation. Maybe a good way to think about the images that we're going to be looking at is if I had assigned these artists this project that I'm giving you and they came up with these solutions, I think these would be excellent solutions. So that's maybe perhaps a more concise or a more descriptive way to talk about that. So the project description at hand by now. Hopefully, the purpose of this project is to create an evocative and rich experience by exploring the expressive possibilities of materials and objects as it relates to the idea of container. You may have wondered about the curious title for this class, Material, Space, and Meaning. And I just want to take a moment and dwell upon that, especially the part about materials, because one of the gifts that we have down here in the sculpture lab or the 3D design department is that we deal perhaps more directly than a few of the other media in that the materials that we use, the history of those materials, the identity of those materials get brought into the artwork and the project and the studio in a very direct way. And this is not to suggest that the other field in a photography and digital media that is not physical or somehow less. It's just to maybe suggest that more often in sculpture the identity of the materials and the source identity and even the sort of the cultural context of the materials that we are using are perhaps a bit more present as an identity and have specific meanings that are present in the finished product. And that's a wonderful, rich history. If you think about all the different materials that surround us, even if you suggest to yourself, well, I just want to make a sculpture out of a piece of wood. It's like, well, okay, so there's a million different kinds of wood out there. Each of them have their unique characteristics. Like ironwood is different than pine, is different than babinga, which comes from the other side of the world, or purple heart, which also comes from the other side of the world, or that's different from um, you know like anything else. Or where are you going to get that piece of wood? You're going to get that piece of wood from your backyard? Are you going to get that from the state park? You're going to drive to Home Depot? You're going to get it there? All of these sources actually inform it. Making art out of 2x4s is a different thing than making art out of wood that comes from branches in your backyard. And so all of these histories, it's a rich, rich language. And we are allowed, and we really kind of celebrate that down in the sculpture department. Again, not that the other areas in art, visual art, don't do that, but for us, the language is perhaps a little bit louder, or perhaps just a little bit more prominent, especially in the finished object. And so, what I'm going to be talking about today and showing you today are examples of things, in which this material history, this material language, is present, it's active, The artists are playing with that and celebrating that and using it to a lot of different means and to a lot of different ends. The other idea here of a container, it's like, well, what the heck? What is this? What is this really about? The idea of a container is perhaps a bit of a loose framework. When I say container, often I think students maybe hear box or like suitcase or like canister or something like. Well, let's just maybe go through these images and look at the different ways that artists have thought about the idea of container or what is contained, or think about this concept of container, because it's very big and it's very expansive, and you can put a lot of stuff into that notion. Okay, so that is perhaps related to some background about the project. The project description itself I'm reading it directly here from the page, make a three-dimensional object in which there is a dynamic tension between materials and the idea of container. The container may be filled or empty or any variation of the two. And so, as I said earlier, probably the best way to do this is to show you some examples, because you have tremendous amounts of freedom. But at the same time, artists never start from nothing. Artists in the studio always have tons and tons of ideas that are generated from previous works. And so, somebody that's my age who's been making work for several decades, I have tons and tons of ideas. I will never run out of ideas in the studio. However, students, who are perhaps new to this field, or perhaps just developing themselves as artists, have perhaps a shallower pool to pull from. And so what I'm doing here then, as I'm showing you all these examples, is I'm sort of feeding you possibilities, feeding you things to think about and work on. What I'm not, of course, what you can't do is just like copy one of these. That's completely off the table. But it is meant to inspire you. So let's take a look. Like I said, we have a lot of images. I'm going to talk about each one, perhaps do a bit more description as we go on here, and talk about each one a bit more in depth. This first one that we're looking at is a sort of a funny piece, from not funny, odd, but in terms of art experiences, it's very maybe singular in contemporary art. Back in the 1960s, this guy, Walter de Maria, who was involved in this way of making art out in the landscape. There was a whole group of what are called land artists who would go out into the deserts and barren spaces, and they would literally sort of sculpt the desert or make these huge pieces out in the landscape. And Walter de Maria was one of this group. De Maria eventually ended up doing this piece in New York. And so if you go to New York, it is actually still installed in New York. And the piece the photo is a little funny. I have to translate it a tiny bit for you. If you want to see the Walter de Maria Earth Room, first of all, you find it on Google Maps. You walk to it. It literally is just like a door that's in the side of a building. The Dia Foundation, Walter de Maria Earth Room, with a little plaque right there. You push the buzzer, they let you in. You walk up to the second floor, you turn the corner, and this is what you see. You see a glass wall, which is about 3 feet high, and you see this room, which is a gallery space, which is completely white walls, that is filled about 2.5 feet deep with this really great, rich black dirt, the kind of stuff that you buy at the garden center. It smells, it's great, especially if you go there in the winter. It's really wonderful. And this is the piece that de Maria made, 60s or 70s, I don't remember the exact date, but it has been maintained since then. And it's such a funny piece. The land artists were so much about scale. They were so much about sort of creating a different relationship to art and understanding, and breaking down divisions between maybe just kind of expanding the gallery. For us, it's super common now to go out and see murals painted outside, or people making artwork outside spontaneously. Very less common back then. And so one of the things that was happening in this time for artists, that they were expanding what the gallery meant, what it was, and maybe suggesting that the gallery is not just the only place you can make art. And so de Maria's Earth Room, the experience that when you walk up into this space, when you walk and you stand there and you smell this, and especially when you walk up those stairs and you see this, you just sort of experience the weight, in your bones. It's really hard to describe, but you sort of feel the weight of all of this earth. You smell it. It's a very sensual kind of experience, and it's fantastic. What does this have to do with the container project? Well, here's a question. Is an architecture a container? I think architecture is exactly a container. It's a container that contains people and that shapes action and does all these really great things. But architecture is a way of thinking about space. There's an inside and an outside. So absolutely, it's a kind of container. And the thing about this particular piece, the Earth Room, is that it's totally playing around to this idea of inside and outside, literally sort of bringing the outside in to allow you to see it afresh, experience it afresh. It is just a pile of dirt, and yet when you come up and you hit that corner and you turn and you see it, you sort of experience, the wonderfulness of this very common material. So Walter DeMaria, if I had given him this assignment and he showed up with the Earth Room, I would say, good job, very nice. Over the arc of this lecture, which is going to be longer than all the other lectures that I've done, I need to kind of describe a bit more, but we're generally starting here with ideas that are perhaps more physically based, that are much more about the materials, and we're going to move into ideas that are perhaps a bit more conceptual. The work here you're looking at is by the artist Tara Donovan. Tara Donovan is a very noteworthy artist, abstract sculptor, and one of the things that she does in her career is she uses what are called post-industrial materials, or materials that have been created through industrial systems. And see if you can for a minute, as you're looking and I'm describing this piece, see if you can for a moment try to figure out the materials. These are super common objects that she has used to create this installation. So Tara Donovan, in working with materials, she uses things that have been manufactured. So she doesn't go out to the lumberyard like tomorrow, and buy stuff at Home Depot. She doesn't go to the Earth Room. She doesn't carve in stone. She buys things. She buys things at stores, and those become, often her materials. She manipulates them, of course, but they become the materials that she works with. This is the piece that you're looking at. The way that she created this work is an empty gallery space. I'm guessing the dimensions of that wall in the back is 35 feet or so. It's a pretty big space. And what she did was she went up and she arranged all of the lights in the gallery, and then she and her assistants constructed this piece that hangs from the gallery space. It's very cloud-like. I've seen versions of these. They're really beautiful and elegant and super fun. Have you figured out what those objects are yet? Those objects are just the lowly styrofoam cups, the kinds that you get, coffee with if you're at a really bad conference and they don't have good coffee. So just like these lowly cups, and by by application of you could say creative energy, by application of focus, and just by having some fun at the materials and being inventive, she's really transformed it. And so maybe a question here is like, what's the container? The container could be, the cup, right? Because that's a container. So absolutely, she's transforming these. She's creating a dynamic relationship between the cup and its environment, but also the gallery space itself. The gallery, again, architecture can be kind of a container. And so she's transforming this architectural situation that she's working in right there. So really beautiful, a very simple gesture. One of the things that I love about this is this whole, often, people will think that art is prohibitively expensive to make, and even like large installations. It's like, how much does this piece cost? Like a couple $100 worth of styrofoam cups and some hot glue. You pretty much got it. And yet it's very elegant. It's really gorgeous. Another Tara Donovan work. Again, as you look at this, try to figure out what you are actually looking at. Because again, this is a cube that's made of a tiny little object. So try to guess what those tiny little objects are. Right, chat for a second. So she's done a series of these pieces, these cubes, which are freestanding, and they're kind of disassembled every time and reassembled in the for the next exhibit. The piece that you're looking at here is about 3 feet square, and it is a cube made entirely of straight pins, like those pins that you use when you are sewing. And so this piece is crazy heavy because, if you imagine a stack of those pins, it's just sort of monstrous amount of weight that's underneath this thing. So here's a great question. It's like, well, how in the world do you construct these things? How in the world do you actually build this object. And again, one of the things that I love about Tara Donovan's work, being a maker, a guy who makes a lot of things, is that she doesn't actually use a lot of complicated mechanisms. It's not like casting bronze, which is really, technical. It's not like, big fabrication. These are actually relatively simple gestures. And the way that you make this piece is that you get a plywood form, and that's 3 feet, in every dimension, and you set it up, and then you fill the plywood form with straight pins. I'm guessing she probably didn't buy these down at, Target. She probably went to a factory and bought, several £100 worth of these straight pins. But then after you fill it up and sort of tap it in, then you take away the plywood form. So there's nothing holding these in there. It's just friction. So there's not magnets, it's not glue, there's not adhesive, it's just friction. We've all made the sand castle on the beach with the wet sand in the bucket. It's the same strategy. She's made versions of this one with toothpicks and with broken glass as well. But again, the gesture is pretty simple and not complicated, yet really beautiful and elegant. And so again, like, what is the container here? Like, I would say this is a really excellent example of the container project. It's like, well, what's the container? Well, the container is actually no longer here. The container was implied. It was present once. We obviously see that it's here, but actually the container at this point kind of exists in our mind, which I think is a really fun idea too. So again, Tara Donovan shows up with this project for my assignment. I would say, great job, Tara. Very nice. Now go on and win the MacArthur Genius Award like she did, and go have a great career. So. Another artist whose work I enjoy quite a lot, I have 2 big examples of larger installations. Actually, I think 3 examples of his larger installations. Mark Dion, D-I-O-N. Mark Dion, back probably 20 some years ago now, went to the Thames River. That's the river that goes through central London, and he pitched this idea and went to the Thames and did a legit archaeological dig with a group of professionals. And so they took all of the Thames. London has been there for 1,500 years or longer, so there's a lot of archaeology there. And so he went, and they went, in the site, and him and a bunch of assistants, and they basically, did a section of the river and took everything that they could find, went back to the museum, cleaned it up, and then he started to organize it. And if you look at the drawers right in the center here, the cool thing about this exhibit is that you can actually open those drawers, and look, you can't handle the objects, but you can open the drawers and see what's there. And so this is one of the top drawers from this exhibit. And so these are all things that were dug up from the bank of the Thames River. And the pretty cool thing that Mark Dion does in this series, in this object, is that he arranges these things, but not according to the sort of the classic rules of how archaeologists tend to arrange things, which is according to year. Rather, it's like this era, that era, these are all the same objects from 1,000 years ago. These are, all the other objects from 2,000 years ago and whatnot. What he's done instead is he's kind of grouped them all together relative to things like shape, value, texture, but also things like, associative meanings. And so as you start to look at the little tiny bottles on the bottom left, I wish this was a discussion because I would ask you what those are compared to over all these little sort of spiky things on the right. There's a relationship there that's pretty charged. So the objects on the left, way back, starting about 100 years ago or so, before World War I, you could actually walk down to the drugstore and just buy opium. You could go down and buy heroin, and cocaine. I don't know about cocaine, but anyhow, opiates, like powerful opiates that you would, obviously can't buy now. And those are the little vials that you would get, these painkiller, these little glass vials on the bottom left. And then the objects on the right, all those little pokey sticks, those are actually from mixed drinks. So if you go to a bar, they actually don't do that, so much anymore because we're sort of not using plastic as much. But for a long time, these would be like in drinks. And so you get a certain thing, and they would have like fruit poked on these, or olives or whatnot. And eventually these would just get discarded. And so the relationship between these two are kind of about, anesthesia, kind of about the way that we medicate ourselves, the way that we self-medicate ourselves. And so the relationship here, instead of talking about separating things out and talking about differences in history, the piece is actually talking about commonalities through history. Likewise with the section on the top left where you have all those sort of whitish orbs, the relationship between the dolls' heads and the golf balls is real strong. Forms of recreation or just like, playfully arranging things according to these visual characteristics, but really, these are about other kinds of relationships as well. So. And again, sort of like, what's the container here? This is the question I'm going to be asking over and over again. This rhetorical question I'll be asking over and over again. The container is in part, again, the museum. The way that the way that museums tend to categorize. And so there's the larger museum. You have the case that's in the center here that organizes everything. You have this, further classification. And so the museum itself is a way of thinking about how we organize information, how we organize the way that we think about the past, how do we organize the natural world, how we, sort of make all these distinctions and understand meaning and create meaning. So on the one hand, yeah, it's just a drawer. A drawer is a container. A cabinet is a container, for all of this history. I mean, so this works as a container on multiple levels, and each one of those is completely legitimate. So this next work we're going to look at by Mark Dion has some very funny elements about it. It's titled The Library for the Birds of Massachusetts. And you can see that what Dion has done here is he's created a large aviary in this museum. And the aviary actually holds about a dozen zebra finches. The part about this piece that's quite funny is not that this piece is a library of the birds of Massachusetts. It's a library for the birds of Massachusetts. And by that, what Dion has done is actually created, if birds could read, what kind of structure would they live in, what kind of things would we put in there, what would be of interest to our winged friends, and he filled it with all these things about sort of food sources and predators and hunting and all of these sorts of kinds of ideas and information. And of course, it's meant to be funny. And the birds being there, probably interacted with all this information and, made nests out of books and sort of pooped on stuff and like whatever, but they interacted with it in very different ways. And while it is indeed a pretty funny piece, there are layers of humor that sort of these layers of humor, point in directions about information. And again, like the previous piece, Dion's work is a lot about the museum itself, or how we understand information, or how we categorize things or classify things. And so in the same way that that all of the information that's sort of offered to these birds about sort of sustenance and predator and threat and future and sort of their environment and whatnot, these are all things that we are concerned about as well. And so as he's constructing this, he's actually kind of in a tongue-in-cheek way offering us a viewpoint of our own approaches to information, the way that we tend to orient also around sort of sustenance and threat and food and all of these similar kinds of things. So it's a very funny piece. This work is there's such a great story. This is a little bit out of the boundaries of maybe not too much, but a little bit out of the boundaries of the assignment. But I have such a great story about this. So this is Mark Dion created this piece. It's actually down at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. If you go down there now, you can still see it. It's a permanent exhibit. But when it was first introduced or created there, there was a show on sort of super realism in art, or art that is so real that you really can't tell it. It's called simulacra. Simulacra is when something is so real that it kind of looks like the thing that it's representing. And so this was what the show is about. And so Mark Dion came in and he created this from scratch, this museum curator's office from like the 1950s or 60s or so. And I don't know if he had like a real office that he was referencing, but anyhow, he created it, got all the books, got all the hardware, all of this. And he created just like this perfect reproduction. And so I go down there, I take my class down, we're going to go see this show on the simulacra, this big, sculpture and painting show And we had arranged to have a tour. And so we get there, and there's a sweet, older woman, probably 70 or so. And she says, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here. And we're very excited because just recently, this office was discovered that had been boarded up since the 1960s. And so before we go into the real show, I want to show you this thing." And so she takes us over. This is like maybe 75 feet away from the entrance. And she stands my class of about 15 people in front of the door and proceeds to spin this total crazy yarn about how at some point in the 60s this office was accidentally boarded over, and then they recently discovered it, and they just all and so now they're going to leave it just like this. And again, as a reminder, this is just before we're going to be walking into a show about simulacra and hyperrealism in art, fooling the eye in art. And every one of my 15 students just stood there and, just nodded and, "Wow, this is so cool. This is so interesting." And this sweet little old lady, to her credit, never once cracked. She never once broke character. Just, created this entire fantasy for all of them, this fabricated story. And I was just laughing my head off. I couldn't believe that people didn't connect the dots there. In any case, it is a wonderful piece, and again about sort of classification and how we sort of understand things. But anyhow, it's just a good story. Jean Shin is another artist who has a Korean background. She was born in America. Her parents, I believe, emigrated. We showed her at Bethel about 5 years ago, 6 years ago now, maybe. And did an entire installation with her. One of the things that Jean Shin has done over the course of her career is she will often sort of go into communities like ours and work with us to sort of collect and amass things, and then she assembles things out of those, the objects that she has sort of amassed and collected. This is a little bit different from what she typically does, but it's just such a great piece. I've always loved it. Jean Shin, being Asian American, she's talked about in many Asian American communities. One of the things that happens when people immigrate is the one marketable skill they often have, or some of the individuals have, is restaurant. You open up a restaurant and cook and serve this really great food. And what she had noted is that often those become sort of family affairs. Like kids are there, extended family, everybody's sort of there working, and people are washing dishes. And so she talked about having experience with sort of knowing individuals that were in those circumstances. Oh, sorry, I've got ahead of myself a little bit here. And so this is a piece that she kind of created with a little bit of that memory in mind. There actually are, the water between these tanks. Obviously, these are like dishwashing stations, water going from one tank to the next to the next. It's a bit of a fountain, and of course, what do people do when they see fountains? They throw coins in. And she loved that, and she actually embraced that because, it's like when you're washing dishes and you happen to see a few coins in the bottom. How cool is that? And so it's a piece that does many forms of container, you could say, about that. The sinks themselves, are certainly one point. But let's look at one other piece of Jean Shin's that I particularly like about this one. One of my favorites, titled Chance City. For those of you that don't gamble, great. Good job. But these are I believe they're scratch-off lottery cards. In any house, they're like for a lottery, and they've already been used, and so they've been discarded, and they're no longer viable. And so Jean Shin collected all these things, stacked them up, and created this city-like structure that's there, very, very fragile. Looks like it sort of collapse at any second. And I just love the tensions in this piece, because it's so much about aspirations that we all have when we're taking the chance, maybe buying a lottery ticket. We have aspirations. Having somebody in my extended family who is a pretty serious gambling addict. When I look at this, I always think of that individual and the way that he would just like, oh, the next big score, I'm really going to get it, and kind of like building castles in the air. And this seems to me to just capture that so effectively and so nicely that dreams of greatness and success, and yet one good sneeze by a guy walking by and this thing could seem to entirely collapse. So. I just think it's really sort of a wonderful tension, and I have a personal connection with it. because of that story, because of this individual that I know. Kind of, it always reminds me of that. So. And again, as I hope you're realizing now that the idea of container is actually quite an elastic one. Again, it can fit around a lot of ideas. The container here, the lottery tickets, the architecture, the fake architecture that's been created, perhaps a lot of different things that a potential for a lot of different ways of thinking about container. And Jean Shin's final piece that we're going to be looking at is sort of a canopy that she created over a park in New York. If you've been into a place, big city, sudden rainstorm pops up, people buy cheap umbrellas and then they either sort of fold up, catch a wind and they just fold up, or they get discarded. And so she went around, started collecting all these umbrellas and peeling away the metal, and eventually created this sort of canopy, this Uber umbrella, you could say, ultimate umbrella, created this canopy. So, and again, do we need to sort of name the container every time? The umbrella is the container, the canopy itself is a container. But it's just really starting to be, a lovely object. It's just gorgeous and playful and really engaging. And so hopefully you're starting to understand the conversation here. The container project is really an opportunity to start to think about, ways of constructing, ways of building, ideas that you can engage, and so on. So the artist David Hammonds is an African-American individual who makes a fair amount of work about Black communities, especially like urban Black communities. These works here, the Higher Goals, this is actually a set that he had done, I think, back in the 80s or so, and talked specifically in reference to these pieces about the role of basketball, like psychologically the role of basketball in terms of aspirations and in terms of sort of maybe moving past, some desolate circumstances that individuals might find themselves in. Basketball being a communal activity, and yet at the same time, there are some people who kind of get out, who play basketball so well that they achieve, fame, money. Their circumstances change dramatically, but it's a very small amount. And so he has sort of discussed this in terms of being attention. It's a wonderful game. It's community. It's sort of about community, but at the same time, there are these aspirations that are often associated with it that are kind of unrealistic or even unattainable at times. So. Other layers to this too, of course, I'm thinking about, a few of the pieces, especially the two on the left, the way that they've sort of been, laid up with pattern and texture and all these kinds of things. There are echoes perhaps of, ancient African patterns and rhythms and tribal patterns and things that are happening there. I don't know that there are direct quotes, but certainly it feels like there's a bit of an echo happening in some of those. The third one from the left that's all loaded up, that sort of the idea of sort of adding and adding and adding is another thing that can happen frequently in certain kinds of tribal works. It's as you're adding to totems in a certain way, there's gesture, there's meaning, and there's power associated with that. So he's doing a lot of things simultaneously in these pieces and combining a lot of things simultaneously. But again, in a piece like this one, this untitled work, he is talking perhaps more about this idea of basketball being, the potential for escape, the potential for, sort of moving past one's desolate circumstances and into this other idea. And so, he's again sort of taking that on as a subject here in this really tricked out, basketball hoop that's got crystals. If you look closely, you can see like these crystals, like on your grandmother's chandelier, over the dining room table, those kind of crystals, and the lights and the frosted glass, and the thing is just completely tricked out, as if to suggest an idealized state, almost like this heavenly state or this magic, basketball hoop that if you hit it, some really great things are going to happen for you. Another powerful work that David Hammonds did, I think, about mid-90s, don't quote me on that date, In the Hood. If you can't tell what this is, I think it's pretty clear, but it's the hood of a black hoodie that's been severed pretty roughly and hung on the wall, on this very white wall. In this piece, I remember when the first time I saw this, showed it, somebody artist friend showed this piece to me, and it went through the art world kind of like a thunderbolt because it was just so powerful. There's this vision of this. It sort of feels like a severed head, and the black hoodie on an African American guy has such evocative associations in our culture. There's fear there. There's layers there that have been sort of baked into a lot of the ways that we think about African American communities, and I think that David Hammons is sort of poking at that, and he's offering an opportunity to examine that, especially the way that this thing is hung on this like brilliant white wall, which all gallery walls are kind of this brilliant white, but it's a discussion about sort of like fear I find myself even challenged to talk about it in a coherent way because it just seems so powerful and visceral. The way that he's sort of poking and showing us something that's sort of right at the heart of so many of our cultural fears. Not just personal fears, but cultural fears about sort of race and stereotype and some very difficult conversations about that. So. We're going to move on and keep talking about some other works. Giuseppe Pannone. In this work, I believe that's the artist on the bottom. I can't see his face, so I can't tell for sure, but it's the same piece, the same carving that's going on here. Giuseppe Pannone in this work is making the carvings on the bottom. He's making the carving that is showing up on the top. And the carving, to be clear, what's happening here is Giuseppe Pannone is not carving a small tree in the middle of this big tree. What's happening is that he is removing growth rings. And so what he's doing is he's revealing what's there. And so there's a big difference between those two. And so inside of that tree at the top, there is that young, tiny tree that already exists, and he's just revealing it. Which is such a powerful notion. It's such a great idea. And I got to tell you, every time I see this piece by Giuseppe Pannone or any of these pieces, because he's done multiple versions of this right now, I just get a little bit cranky because I feel like I should have thought of this idea first because I love it so much. It punches so many buttons of things that I love to play around with. So. But anyway, it's like, here's something to think about in this, like, what's the container here? And again, to be clear, all he's doing is removing the growth of the growth rings. And so that tiny tree, the smaller tree that you're seeing in there, already exists in every big tree. There's, smaller versions of the bigger tree, younger versions of the bigger tree. And what a powerful metaphor for like personal growth. All of us have smaller versions of ourselves that dwell within us. That are still there intact, isn't there? I mean, there's still a 8-year-old you in the middle of you that's still kind of intact in a way. And I love the way that he allows us to see that in this very abstract way. And if you notice, there's kind of a Home Depot version on the left on the wall too, where he's done that with a single 2x4. So again, what's the container? The container is, I don't know, time? Is it the tree itself? It's like, I don't really care. I mean, it's clearly about being contained. Okay, the piece is clearly about being contained. I don't really know that I have to like name precisely what is being contained. Or maybe I would say there's a lot of ways to think about what's being contained in the idea of container here. So. So Giuseppe Pannone, I give him the container assignment. He comes back with this. Good job, Giuseppe. Thank you. I really like the piece. Another artist, Charles Ladré, has worked in fabric. And we have several artists that we're going to look at in this lecture that work in fabric. And Charles Ladré, I like the pieces. I'll show you a nice slide that kind of describes that in a little bit. But Charles Ladré, often we think of making portraits. When you make a portrait of something, that it's about a person. But, you can also make portraits of inanimate objects. You can make a portrait of a stone. You can make a portrait of a tree. And kind of what's happening here is Ladré is making portraits of all of these clothes. And so these are not clothes that he found. These are clothes that he has created. And so, all the little jackets there, he's kind of hand stitching and hand sewing, and he's making them individually, and it's important that he's making them individually. He's talked about the clothing that he makes as kind of being a stand-in for being able to talk about aspects of masculinity. It becomes a way for him to think about that and consider that from another perspective. And it becomes a substitution, a bit of a stand-in, and that's you find that artists do that a lot. That they rather than sort of they have an idea, something that they really want to engage. They don't just like come right out and like shout it from the rooftops. It's like what they do is they sublimate that and they allow the experience to come out in perhaps other ways. The container? Is it the shop? Is it the little baskets that contain the clothes? Is it the clothing themselves, the clothes themselves? Yes, all of the above. They're all containers. The question is how do you make a deal with the idea of container in compelling ways? Hopefully you're starting to get some ideas here. We have looked at this individual before, Antony Gormley. Gormley is an individual who deals, almost entirely with his own body in some way, the space of his own body. And I think that we can look at him in the context of the container problem. He is defining here for us the space that is contained within his own body. And I think that if he was here and I said that, he would say, yes, absolutely. That's a lot of what this piece is about. So the body is a container. This is one where he's looking at the space on the inside of the body. This is the piece where he's looking at the space on the outside of the body. This is a mold of himself that he made that's actually covered with lead sheet. And so where the previous one is sort of, as I said, sort of inhabiting the inside, this is a piece where he's inhabiting defining the outside, so to speak. The figure is actually based on St. Francis of Assisi. If you are interested in looking at this one a little bit more, I would encourage you to look up the term stigmata, if you don't know what that is, and St. Francis, and then maybe come back and look at this piece. I'll just leave you that little nugget, and you can discover that for yourself. So. The final piece by Antony Gormley is, I would say, if I could maybe steal one artwork or wave a magic wand and have one artwork on the Bethel campus that I chose, this might be one of them. There's another one that I'll show you later that might be my choice too. This is a concrete work, and again, Gormley's body is physically present in this piece. I would point you to the left where you can see, on the end of the concrete, a couple of footprints, negative space kind of receding away from you, and you can also see some little holes on the right part of the image there too. Were you able to get down on your hands and knees and look inside of this thing? What you would see would be a negative space that is precisely Antony Gormley's body. So there is his shape inside in the midst of this thing right here. And of course the 5 holes on the right of the image, those are his fingers that are kind of poking through, and his feet on the bottom. There's a little spot for his head on the top. And so you look in and you can see his arms and his leg and his belly button is it's all there. The mold is all there. So, and I love this piece, the container. Wow. This is a work. Why would I want this piece around Bethel? Because I think this is a really gorgeous kind of meditation on the crucifixion and the resurrection. Christ is no longer there. I don't know that Gormley was necessarily making that statement with this piece, but I think as a believer in the iconography of the image, I can really sort of get that and I can celebrate that. So. Diana El Hadid is our next artist. She's an American artist who emigrated, I believe, when she was young from Syria with her parents. And so anyhow, she has that heritage, and there's a connection there, which is why I mention it. So. Unlike, maybe somebody like Giuseppe Pannone, whose materials are very, very super self-evident and very obvious, and a physical part of that, you can't really sort of fake the tree thing. Can't make a fiberglass tree, and pull that piece off. Diana El Hadid's work actually does employ a lot of synthetics, polymers and fiberglass and different structures, different kinds of materials to create the structures that she's engaging in and sort of fabricating. And I throw these out here. I mean, her work is maybe not a super great fit for the assignment, but holy smokes, look at that. Her work, Nolly's Orders, and I'll give you the history of the piece here in the next slide, but just the physicality of this, the visuality of this in terms of container and layering and the figure. I mean, these are works. She's an artist that I have been aware of for some time, only more recently started to kind of seriously study her work. yeah, in terms of like a personal history and cultural history, but just the way that she is able to simultaneously create, the impression of looking through landscape or looking through time itself. I just think that they're sort of astonishing. And even like I said, even though that the materiality, the synthetics and steel and wood and paint and all of this, there's a lot of artifice, you could say. Like a lot of the materials here are really hidden. That's not necessarily a bad thing. For this assignment, it's maybe a little sort of on the edge of what we were hoping to claim, but absolutely, they're fantastic pieces. It's just a different direction. It's not a poorer sculpture. It's just a slightly different way of thinking about sculpture. But just the way that the spaces that she's able to create, like these dripping spaces, falling, collapsing, sort of ascending and rising, the strata of history that's kind of like stacked and stacked and stacked. Um, just so gorgeous and beautiful. These rivers kind of trickling down and collapsing. They're just very invigorating and terrific pieces. And I like it because it is I think she is a person that's dealing authentically with the figure. Kind of an ongoing conversation. I think in contemporary art is like, why is it that 50, well, actually 500 years ago, the figure was prominent. Like everybody was working with the figure all the time. Like Michelangelo, and like that was really the center of everything. And why is it that now there are relatively fewer, people making figurative work? I think that's a really intriguing question. It's too big to take on right here, but one of the qualities about Diana El Hadid's work that I really love is the authentic way that she's able to bring the figure back and make it look fresh, put it into a contemporary context in a way that really is sort of sizzling, and it works, and it's just fantastic. I love it. So anyhow, the piece is Nolly's Orders. This is literally just a cut and paste from a website. Don't so plagiarism all over the place. Absolutely. Nolly's Orders was inspired by sources ranging from Italian and Northern Renaissance painting. Nolly's Orders, by the way, is the title of this piece. Renaissance painting to Gothic architecture and Hellenistic sculpture. Its title refers to an 18th century Italian architect and surveyor, Giambattista Nolli, who's known for an iconic map of Rome that he completed in 1787. You know anything about Rome, there's a lot of history there. Dig a shovel down and you're going to suddenly you're back 3 generations. And I love the way that she's able to allow us to sort of see the spectrum of that history in an instant. So if you're interested, go ahead and make one of these for the assignment. I'd love to see that. Another artist we're going to look at, just a couple works by this guy, who's actually probably one of the more well-known. I don't like to use the word famous because I think fame is not necessarily where we ought to be headed necessarily in most of the things that we do. He's super famous, but I would say the work is legit, and he's certainly a well-known guy. His name is Anselm Kiefer. And one thing that he has done, Kiefer has a wide body of work. He has literally has factories that makes this stuff. Just like dozens and dozens of people that work for him. But I want to maybe just focus on like one body of work that he does, which are these very large books. And one of the materials that Kiefer works with pretty consistently is lead sheet. And so if you know anything about lead sheet, I mean, I've actually worked with it many times because I used to be a builder, and I've actually I did a couple of X-ray rooms where you line X-ray rooms with this stuff. It's very heavy, and he makes books out of this lead sheet. So the book that you're looking at the top left there is actually probably about chest high to me, 4 feet high anyway, 5 feet high, so large. And so this book probably weighs in the order of 500-600 pounds. The stack of books on the bottom right, it looks like it may be a tabletop piece. No, I'm guessing it's like 4 feet tall. But he makes these gigantic lead books that actually have pages that are transcribed. A lot of times these pages are things like star charts, constellation charts, certain kind of mappings of the heavens and things like that. So that's a bit of an intro because I like to talk about the idea of books being a form of container. It's really kind of late to the game in this conversation. Is a book a container? Are you kidding me? Like it's like that. It's defined by what it contains, by what's inside. Absolutely. So the piece that we're looking at here on the right is Kiefer has done several of these pieces where he creates these bookshelves, with steel bookshelves that contain these lead books. And so you can see the scale of that of the structure by the scale of the individual there. I don't really know how much this piece weighs, but I'm guessing it probably weighs 5, 6, 7 tons. And it's a massive piece. And when you see these pieces in person, they just feel heavy. They feel that you got the weight. You can just sort of, feel the ponderous nature of these books. They just, they're physically heavy. They're sort of philosophically very heavy, and the weight is put to that purpose. These are not pieces that you could make out of fabric, because they are about sort of fallenness and our physical nature, and very large ideas. You're not meant to. Maybe what I would say is that individual who's looking at these books is meant to be on the outside of these books. These are to quote the Bible, these are sort of things that are too wonderful for him to understand. And so that's the nature of Kiefer's. The kinds of things that he creates are dealing with sort of very large and epic scales. He has gotten critique from time to time about just being sort of all about sort of the monumental and the eternal and the epic. Like him or hate him, that sensibility is certainly present. But the idea of this, the marriage of this, the idea of the book and this lead sheet, and the weight of that and the combination of the two is very powerful. And I think at the very least you have to admit that they really work in creating an experience for the viewer that's unique and very distinctive. This next artist is the Colombian artist Doris Salcedo. There are two pieces by Doris Salcedo, and I think maybe what I'll do is I'll talk less about this one and a bit more about the other one, even though she's a terrific artist. Doris Salcedo, Colombian, about 60 years of age or so, and for most of her life, Colombia has been in some kind of political or drug-related civil war, and so it's a place with a lot of loss. And her works, pieces such as this one, are ways that she uses to kind of commemorate personal loss in the face of such difficult and personal struggle that's just gone on for decades and decades and decades. And so this would be a wardrobe, just a personal wardrobe that somebody would have had in their home. She often works with personalized objects like this and manipulates them, often filling them with concrete like this as a way of thinking about the memories that get attached to objects. You've done this, right? You've had an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent or somebody that has, maybe passed away, and suddenly the objects that they're surrounded, that they lived with, become infused with all this meaning. And so Doris Salcedo, in her work, engages that and tries to articulate that and tries to frame that, by manipulating these objects. Things like chairs. So that's a chair that's at the bottom of that in this wardrobe. This is perhaps the piece that I really want to talk about, though. That Doris Salcedo is a major piece by her. What you're looking at right here is a crack in the floor. Again, I said it was a concrete piece. The gallery that we're looking at on the right is the Tate Modern Gallery, which is a huge, huge space. And you can see the crack in the floor on the image on the right. You can see the tiny little crack. And the other end of this gallery, which is called Machinery Hall, which is seriously, it feels like it's a football field away when you're there. But in the course of this piece, one of the things that Doris Salcedo has created is her piece really is the crack in this floor. And so in the Machinery Hall, they invite artists to come in about every 6 months or so and make a major piece in this huge cavernous space. And what Doris Salcedo did was to make this crack in the floor. Technically, I really don't know how she did it, but she figured it out anyway. And at the entrance at the bottom of the image on the right, that's where you just walk into the space. On the far end of the space, you actually sorry, I thought I had another image of it, but I don't. At the far end of the space, it sort of gets wider and wider and wider until it's finally like 2 feet apart in this crack in the floor on the far end of the space. So Doris Salcedo has talked about that relative to being an outsider, and as she has discussed this piece, the Tate Modern, which is in London, which, the British Empire was like the biggest empire, and Colombia was a colony, not of the Brits, but and so when she came as a Colombian, this former colonial country, and came to London and wanted, was making this piece, like that was a layer that was there, And so this piece is really about separation. This piece is about sort of haves and have-nots. Being on one side of a crack and being on the other side of a crack. The crack starts out really small. Then when you get down to the other end of the space, the crack gets larger and larger, and pretty soon you can't cross it anymore. And so the piece for her is really about a separation, a feeling first of all, as a woman, second of all, as a Latin American woman, somebody from, this part of the world that's not, an art center. It's a conversation that's a lot about being on the outside. The title of the work is Shibboleth. If you remember your Old Testament history, there's an episode with the Israelites where they were trying to separate friend and foe from the people that are around them, and they found that all of their friends were able to pronounce the word Shibboleth, but their foes were not. And so when they would ask somebody, so this was the test. They would go out and they'd just say, well, so say this word. And so if the person was not able to say it, probably without an accent, then they were killed because they were the enemy. That was how they were identified. And if you think about language, and if you think about speaking, and the way that accents and things like that, especially somebody from Central South America gets so easily identified and pigeonholed by an accent, or by being from a certain part of the country. It's a very courageous piece that she did, at the Tate Modern in the center of London, and is probably one of my favorite works. And I wish I could figure out how she did it, because I think it's a really dynamic piece. We did previously talk about Rachel Whiteread's piece, and so I didn't necessarily want to chat about that one anymore. But I did also want to point out that she also did a piece in Machinery Hall. So don't get dizzy, I'm going to back up 2 slides. So you can see on the image on the right, the windows on the far right. And so I'm going to go ahead a couple images. So there you go. So those are the same images. And so now you can start to get a sense of this scale of this, which is about 4 stories tall or so. And this was a piece that Rachel Whiteread did. I just wanted to mention again another sort of funny story about this. Remember, she makes castings of the interior of spaces. These are all castings of the interior of cardboard boxes. And so they're all like cast in fiberglass or something, and then they're stacked up. And one of the things that she has talked about this one, that I don't think it was a major source, but one of the ideas she had in mind as she worked on this was the final scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark, when they wheel the Ark of the Covenant. It's all crated up, and they just wheeling it down this set of crate after crate, and it's like this monstrous cavernous warehouse of all these boxes. And so she wanted to create that sense. So, well, we'll move on. Do Ho Suh, who is a Korean artist who, again, has done perhaps many things in his life, and we don't want to reduce him to a single kind of idea, but I think that there are one body of work that he's worked on in particular is quite a beautiful, lines up really nicely with the project that I've given you about the container, and that are he's made these houses out of silk, and if you know anything about history, like silk was traditionally been used for parachutes because it's semi-transparent, and so Do Ho Suh over the course of his career has actually documented most of the houses that he has lived in by making reproductions of them in this fabric. And when I say he, I mean obviously he's working with like teams of seamstresses to do this, but he's overseeing the project. And so this is a piece that he had done. I believe this is the house that he grew up in Korea. And you can see, and this is not just sort of like a little approximation, and I'll show you a detail of what he's done later, details. You can see some of the really gorgeous stuff that happens. But these pieces are sort of floating, they're suspended, they're sort of up in the air as if they're on a parachute. And they are probably the most beautiful things ever created. They're so gorgeous. So if you ever get a chance to see Do Ho Suh's work, and there you can see an interior shot of the apartment. And what you're looking at here is indeed all fabric. And so this is not the apartment itself. This is his, this is rendered all in fabric. And this is the piece that you are actually, that would be sort of elevated up above. There's another one right there. Yeah, and the thing that's quite gorgeous about these, and by the way, the first image that you saw, this was his house in Korea, and this image right here, so you can see the first house that I showed you on the inside of this one. That's another version of how he's put these two together. One house inside, another one that he's currently living in. So it's some pretty nice overlay between like a sense of history here, and also the Giuseppe Pannone, the tree in the side of the tree. Andrea Zattel. This is an artist whose work I think is just keeps getting smarter and smarter for me. She's done a number of, I would say, like uh, the goal of her work is to examine how we live, and to kind of challenge that. And one of the things that she's done over the course of her life is she has really challenged the idea of sort of fashion and clothing. And this was this palimpsest. A palimpsest, by the way, is an ancient manuscript where, when vellum was really precious, what you would do is you would write in one direction, and then when that piece of text on that vellum was no longer needed, what they would do, they would scrape off that text, and then they would write over it again. But sometimes layers of that previous text would emerge through. So that was the meaning behind that. But this particular exhibit, Andrea Zattel actually created all of these dress forms, and rather than sort of having them only on display, they were actually like a lending library. So you could come, you could sort of like literally sort of check one of these out, take it home, wear it for a couple of weeks, because this is how she lives. Over the course of her life, over the last 20 years or so, she has created uniforms for herself that she wears. These are some of them. I think I have this right. The titling of this image was a little murky, but she has created uniforms for herself. So she'll design a dress, she'll fabricate it, super high quality, make it herself, and then that becomes the thing that she wears for the next 6 months. And she just keeps doing this over and over and over again, and then collecting these, amassing these. And I love this as a strategy. And the reason that I think that she is sort of ahead of her time and her work just keeps getting smarter and smarter for me is the way that it challenges a lot of expectations or ways that we typically approach fashion. The idea that you would wear the same thing forever, of course, you don't do that because you want to look, fresh every day, right? But she challenges. She's also done pieces where she makes clothing only using like one strand of thread or one strand of yarn, kind of knitting these things that then she will wear for an extended period. But these are not like iterations of, things that are going to be, sort of swapped in and out. But the idea is that she is sort of living in this way and choosing to live in a very different way or substantially different way, intentionally, and turning that process into an artwork. Likewise, she has also created structures like this. She's also known, probably actually more known, for making these houses or these little pods that people can live in, so you can climb in and you can like go to these places during these exhibits and check them out and actually live there for a day or two. But she's also known for challenging expectations about how we live, and I love that as a way of thinking. Social action. It's art, it's social action, it's personal expression, it's a personal challenge. I think there's just a lot of layers here that are really wonderful. And I guess my point when I look at something like this, this is not merely fashion, but the goal of this piece of clothing would be that people would kind of think about their clothing differently. And so clothing as container, yes, of course, absolutely. It can be. And also, it doesn't have to just be the typical fashion sensibility where you just keep cranking out product. It can be fashion as a way of thinking differently about living. Shanique Smith is another artist who works with fabric a lot. An artist that I've only recently discovered. I saw this piece right here about 3 years ago in LA and kind of fell in love with her work. Because she uses a lot of discarded material, and she uses like all that stuff that ends up at the Goodwill and ends up at these secondhand places. And there are actually places where you can go and you can buy like bales of these discarded clothing, synthetics and polyesters and all of this stuff. And she makes these sculptures out of that stuff. And the thing that you can't really see from these photographs, or you think that you maybe don't see as much from these photographs, is the degree to which there's age and there's history. These are not necessarily clean. I would say they're not dirty, but they are not like fresh off the factory floor. They've been out, they've been in circulation, they've been put back. And so she's using it. That history, that patina of age, is part of the pieces, and she has talked about that as being really essential to her work, and thinking specifically about sort of clothing and homelessness. For her, there's strong connections. They're kind of like strong personal connections. She talked about where she grew up. There were situations where she would look out and kind of like sort of notice the connections between homelessness and this this clothing and this patina of age that it would have. And one of the observations that she has made from both of that is you can tell a lot about a society by what they discard. And so really what she's looking at is, and using in her work, are these discarded materials. And so like homelessness is about discarded people, and that's how she has described some of her ideas about that. In any case, they're really sort of wonderful. I'm going to back up one more image. They're really wonderful pieces that are colorful. And these are her two paintings. I actually saw this show, so I can attest to, the painting, which also have these sculptural elements that lean up or sort of orient themselves around them too. It's quite a nice back and forth between, the color of the paints and the color of the fabric. And she really is like painting with fabric in these pieces, in these Bale pieces, these Bale variant series that she's been working on. They're kind of simultaneously paintings and sculptures at the same time. So clothing, and I'm talking about several pieces here, that are using clothing. Okay, so I have two by this artist, Stephen Kaltenbach. This is a little structure it's a pipe that's welded. He makes these time capsules, and I think these are just so funny that I just wanted to include them. They're maybe not as physically developed as some of the other ones, but I think that they have great humor and wit about them. Open after my death. And so these are welded on the ends. And so there's a little arrow where you should cut this thing. And of course, the question is like, what in the heck is on the inside of this thing? Because this is like a steel pipe that's been stamped like this. So what the heck is on the inside of this? Of course, Stephen Kaltenbach is not saying, and if you want, you can buy the piece. The question that I always ask my students when I'm giving this in discussion is, okay, so you own this piece, Stephen Kaltenbach dies, so do you open it? Like, well, see, I always say, I would not open it because it doesn't say you have to open it. It doesn't say you have to open it immediately after his death. But generally my students say, yeah, you got to open it and see what's going on. But, well, I maybe disagree. This is perhaps a little bit darker, open after World War III. Oof. Okay. Well, the idea of mystery, maybe where we're going with this one relative to the container project is the idea of mystery. Like so much of container can be about mystery and like sort of intentionally creating that mystery, which could be another strategy as well. We're getting down close to the end. Tadashi Kawamata, again, architecture. We've talked about several situations, seen several artists here who've dealt with architecture in some ways, but I want to sort of introduce it formally as a direct topic. And Tadashi Kawamata, again, sort of these are one of the many things that he does in his career. He makes these structures in very unpredictable places, almost like birdhouses. You can't really occupy them. Wouldn't it be great if you could climb up? This is one that's in Central Park. And I love the tension in this one between that penthouse apartment on the corner of the loop there, just behind the structure. That's probably a $10 million apartment. And Tadashi Kawamata's making these pieces that talk about this other relationship to nature, is making it out of this kind of scrappy looking wood. It's almost like if people made houses the way that birds make houses, this is what it would look like. And I love the way that he just contrasts that. And a lot of his pieces kind of look like this. They are, very playful and fun, and maybe think more about an organic relationship to architecture rather than such a history-based relationship to architecture that's represented here. So, all right. Cornelia Parker is a British artist. I have two works by her, which are both really sort of gorgeous and also quite large. This piece, I think, is about 20 feet tall or so, probably 15 feet on the side. Anti-Mass is the name of this one. Cornelia Parker, for this work, went to a site. There was a Southern Baptist church, predominantly African American Baptist church in the South, that at one point, so this piece I think is probably about 20 years old by now, so before that, it was felled by arson. So somebody came by and had, racially motivated event, who knows, but they burned this church up. And so she went to the site, asked the people if she could, take some materials, and then borrowed those and created this piece out of the remnants from that church. So it's all just charcoal, that's suspended. It's hanging from the ceiling with the like monofilament line. Another terrific piece. Wish we could sort of wave the magic wand and have this one here, because it's so much about, for me, the piece reads so much about sort of like death and resurrection. Again, I'd like to put this one and the Anthony Gormley cross, piece together in an exhibit, because they both speak so wonderfully about different possibilities and interpreting the resurrection. I think it's quite gorgeous, and it's so delicate. Just sort of hovers in space. I like the way that you can start to see some of the structure of the building again. The mass that's there. The title is very witty. Anti-mass feels almost like a scientific term. Probably is used in some physics aspects. But there's another one that she has done, which is also related to it. This is the first one that she had put together that sort of brought her a little bit more prominence. Cold Dark Matter and Exploded View. This is a British garden shed where she had, just kind of your basic garden shed with gardening tools and whatnot, that she took out into the countryside and or connected with the British military and said, please, sir, I would like to blow this shed up. Would you do that for me? And of course, they were delighted to do that. And so she constructed the shed out on the bomb site, and they literally sort of blew it up with some C4. She collected it's an explosive, and then she collected all the parts and reconstructed it in this way. And then in the center of this thing, there's this crazy intensive light bulb, which are casting all these shadows all over everything. So, and again, it's sort of both this one and the previous one are curious in the way that they are they about sort of container? Yes, destruction of container. I like the way that they both kind of have these spiritual layers to them. The previous one is perhaps a little bit more obvious, but this one, the idea of the Big Bang, perhaps, or the origin, or these kinds of epic destructions, which can almost feel like eschatological or apocalyptic in nature. The last artist we have today, I just have a single image by Dennis Oppenheim. And so in my imaginary show that I'm able to steal all these artworks and install them at Bethel, this is the last one that I would steal, the device for rooting out evil. And I would put it up on Seminary Hill so you could stand in one spot and see that old chapel that's up there that looks just like this. And then you could look over and see the sculpture. And again, I think I've maybe covered the idea of architecture and possibilities and all the different ways, in terms of like clothing and books and architecture and just plain structure and a lot of these. I mean, there's just tons and tons of ways to think about the idea of container, and usually by this point, students will have an idea or two of things that they want to play around, or at least some potential directions that they can begin to experiment with. So I'll just leave you with this image as a way of cleansing the palate. I'm not going to try to talk about it anymore. I'm just going to leave it there for a moment while I chat about some of the other things that we need to get to for the assignment. In terms of the different guidelines for the project, let's maybe just do this, like some basic principles or some guidelines about this. I would say, everything is wide open in terms of what you can use, the materials and so on. And most likely at this point, you do have some ideas, some possibilities. You say, I really liked Andrea Zattel's, piece of this idea of sort of making clothing that that I can sort of represent ideas with, or maybe Anselm Kiefer, this idea of making a book that's not out of paper, but some other materials. Fantastic. It's great to borrow all those kinds of ideas. But a key idea in making art is that generally, and I've talked about this many times, generally the ideas that we come up with initially, the light bulbs over our heads, are really just a start. And to think that that's going to be it, I think, is to kind of set yourself up for a certain level of disappointment, or a lot of disappointment, because the thing that we imagine never really exists. It can't exist. It's too divorced from reality. It doesn't have any physicality. And so what you need to do is you got to develop it. And so those best ideas that you have, they're a great, great place to start. That's why I showed you all these images, so that you can start to spark something. But I would say that even the best idea that you have is I would even use the word impoverished. It's an impoverished vision of what's possible. And that means that it's a poor vision of what's possible. So you need to develop this. You need to get in and get started. A thing that I have said many times is, like, I can always tell when a student is in trouble when I hear the phrase, "I know exactly what I'm going to do. All I have to do is construct it." Because that student really doesn't have a good sense that ideas are developed. They still are thinking that they can imagine a solution, and it literally just needs to be fabricated. It's like things are going to happen that you don't know. And also most of the time too, the best ideas lie in the materials and in the fabrication. So it's not that we're lousy imaginers, it's just that better things lie in the process. So it's not so much a negative comment as a positive one. It's like, it's not about our ineptitude in imagining, it's about, well, there's just so much better that you don't know yet. That's really what that statement is about. So the second one, if you've seen it before, don't make it now, which it would include the things that I just showed you. So if you said, wow, I really do want to, I really was intrigued by this idea of making big, heavy books or books out of other materials. Yes, of course you can do that. Anselm Kiefer does not have a lock on making books out of, metal. You can do that. You just can't make Anselm Kiefer's books. Okay, you can't make things that look like his, or, you can borrow ideas. You just can't, wholesale adopt them. Happy to chat more about with you individually if you'd like. The third one, push materials as far as you can. One of the bigger challenges we have as artists as we're making things is we tend to love our own ideas best. And that, what I mean by that is, I fall in love with a particular thing, and as I make it, I love the thing that I've made, because of course those are all ideas that I'm drawn to. And not only that, it's mine. And so as you're making art for other people, you need to push it farther and farther and farther to make it convincing for that individual. So make it bigger, spread it out, raise it up, finish it off, and even make the works kind of ridiculously excessive. If you think about Anselm Kiefer's books, I keep going back to that, but maybe just, okay, so one more time. Anselm Kiefer's books don't work if they're the size of a normal book and they just happen to weigh like 40 pounds. It's like, no, they actually have to be kind of absurdly heavy to really be as expressive as they can possibly be. All right. A couple other things that I mentioned in the project description, those are, I'm happy to chat about that. Most of that overlaps with this, but a couple other things that I mentioned from the project description. We don't really want scrapbooks or memento displays. So this is not an opportunity for you to collect a bunch of pictures and staple them to something. Like, no, we're not doing that. So nostalgia is great. We're just not doing it here. We don't want anything related to cute. Like, this is not about cute. This is about another way of thinking about materiality, fabrication, container. It's not suggesting, the opposite of cute is not serious, by the way, because we can think about Mark Dion and the bird aviary, where he's making the library for the birds. That's a very funny piece, and so you are allowed, of course, to be funny. You are allowed to be witty. You are allowed to engage ideas, but we're just sticking clear of cute and sort of nostalgic and all of that kind of stuff that sort of smacks of sentimentality. So we're going to steer clear of that. Okay, so we are going to have an in-process critique for this. I would say we'll talk more about this in class, but get started. A good place to start is literally just kind of collecting material, some things that you might want to work with, and get that together, start to amass that, and begin to work. Looking forward to seeing what you folks come up with.